But first, you want to know why the federal Liberal Party is less popular than a vegan sausage sizzle in North Queensland, and why they're failing to make any inroads at state level around the country? Well, let me show you. 2 weeks ago, the Victorian Labor government announced that it would introduce a treaty with the state's Indigenous population. It's a terrible plan that, if legislated, will effectively create a race-based parliament within the state parliament. So I got on this program the State Liberal Aboriginal Affairs spokeswoman, Melina Barth, and she rightly pointed out on this program that the treaty was a terrible idea. And so I asked her what I thought was a pretty obvious question: would the Victorian Liberals repeal the treaty if they are elected into government next year? If this treaty is as bad as you say, and I agree with you, why wouldn't you just tonight tell all the Victorians, you elect us and this treaty will be put in the bin? I mean, surely that's what Victorians would want to hear from a Conservative government.
I completely agree. At this point in time, the reality is we have a process through the Liberals and Nationals, and I'm a process girl because we need to really ensure that we can make commitments.
How much process do you need for something? Sorry, how much process do you need for something so divisive?
That's fine. I appreciate it. Invite me back on in 2 weeks and I'll be able to make all sorts of commitments.
Invite me back on in 2 weeks and I'll be able to make all sorts of commitments. Well, 2 weeks has gone by and I invited the Liberal Aboriginal Affairs spokeswoman back to fill us in on all those commitments. We were advised she was busy tonight and that the process was still underway. So that's the state of the Liberals in Victoria. Should we promise to repeal legislation that would permanently divide citizens according to race? I don't know. Let's spend 2 weeks thinking about it and then think about it some more. We don't want to be too hasty. I'd say they're not hasty enough, and I know a certain Andrew who might agree with me, but I digress. This is modern Liberal politics. No decisions, no principles, just the gentle hum of a committee meeting that never, ever seems to end. Are we surprised, though, that the Victorian Liberals need weeks to decide whether or not they should promise to repeal the treaty? After all, they're just aping their federal colleagues. While Anthony Albanese was busy lecturing the United Nations today on the need to re-engineer society in pursuit of net zero, opposition leader Sussan Ley is still trying to work out whether or not she believes in net zero. The Federal Liberal Party is currently taking 12 months to figure out what they think about an issue that's dominated Australian politics for the best part of a decade. Have a listen to what Sussan Ley said last week when asked what her energy policy was.
Our energy policy is going through a detailed policy development process. That's our energy policy more broadly.
What? The Liberals' energy policy is going through a detailed policy development process. That's our policy. That's not a policy. She's trying to avoid saying they don't have a policy on the most important issue facing our country. And they wonder why they're tanking in the polls, both federally and in Victoria. In the place of a policy, will they have a process?
We've got a working group led by Dan Tehan. He's in the US at the moment. He's studying the latest developments in nuclear. And we've got colleagues across our parliament in terms of our parties meeting together and having really detailed, informative policy discussions. That work will continue as it should.
OK, so what's your position on net zero or nuclear power or the whole Australia as a renewable energy superpower thing? She'll let us know what she thinks just as soon as the working group lets her know what she thinks. And that will happen God only knows when. Sussan Ley, like her Victorian Liberal Aboriginal Affairs spokeswoman, seems desperately afraid of taking a position. And I'll tell you why. Because taking a position is what leaders do. Sussan Ley prefers the warmer waters of management. And that is a fundamental problem. The Liberal Party doesn't need a manager. It needs someone with conviction, with guts, with spine. It needs a leader who doesn't consult a whiteboard before every media appearance. The last thing the coalition or the nation needs is the sort of politician who'd call for a fact-finding mission to determine whether the ship is sinking while standing ankle deep in water on the lower deck. Remember her first speech as Liberal leader back in June? It was an indicator of things to come. She told the National Press Club she was a zealot when it came to getting more women into positions of leadership. Now, zealot is a strong word, usually reserved for those on a mission with fire in their belly. But Sussan, ever consistent in her inconsistency, immediately watered it down by next declaring herself agnostic on how to achieve the goal of more women in Parliament. Imagine Martin Luther nailing his 95 thesis to the Wittenberg church door and then saying, but you know, if the Catholics want to keep selling indulgences, well, that's cool too. Having declared herself a zealot for championing women, she told the Press Club this.
If some state divisions choose to implement quotas, that's fine. If others don't, that's also fine.
In other words, she's a zealot for more women in the party, just not so zealous that she'd risk actually having a view on how to do it. Ley might be perfectly suited to running a middle-tier HR company or department, but you don't win back government by being agnostic about everything and zealous about nothing. In an age where Australians are crying out for clarity, strength and principle, Ley offers a process, a pathway and, God forbid, a PowerPoint presentation. If the coalition hopes to return from the political wilderness, it needs leaders, not facilitators of focus groups. And right now, Sussan Ley sounds less like the alternative Prime Minister and more like the chair of the catering committee. I mentioned that the Liberals aren't being hasty in their decisions. Well, we're now being told by sources within the coalition that Andrew Hastie is a threat to Sussan Ley's leadership. Well, he might be a threat to her position, I agree with that, but he's not a threat to her leadership because you can't threaten what doesn't exist. Andrew Hastie, who has been clearly and succinctly articulating policy positions on everything from energy to manufacturing and immigration, is a threat to Sussan Ley's process-driven managerial style. Now, of course, he told 2GB today that he's no threat to Sussan Ley.
Look, I support Sussan. Anyone who's speculating otherwise is being mischievous.
Everyone knows that I support the leader typically means you're in the late stages of planning a coup against the leader. But at risk of repeating the joke, let's not be too hasty.
My main concern is that the centre-right is fragmenting. We've seen the rise in the One Nation vote and other micro-parties, and having us fragmented on the right is very strategically advantageous for Labor. And so I'm simply saying what people out on the street are looking for in their political leadership.
Andrew Hastie may very well support Sussan Ley, but he's a huge threat to her position, and so he should be. The coalition won't manage themselves back into government, and they won't manage the country back to prosperity. The country needs leadership. And if Sussan Ley needs working groups, processes and months of roundtable talk fests before she can work out what a Conservative is, well, she ain't the Conservative leader, even if she's sitting in the big chair. Andrew Hastie is now the Liberal Party leader. He just hasn't been given the position yet.